Plus, you can't blame me for how I talk. I just had a crappy childhood.
To be a fan of traditional Japanese RPGs in the late 2000s was to be suffering. The PlayStation 3 struggled to find its footing for several years, leaving it bereft of RPGs compared to the PS2. Meanwhile, the Xbox 360 was struggling to find acceptance in Japan. Microsoft, in an attempt to penetrate this market, appealed to a number of Japanese developers through funding or other means to make RPGs for its console. The results were mixed, yet consistently interesting and often overlooked. In the wake of this period came such games as Infinite Undiscovery, Eternal Sonata, and The Last Remnant, just to name a few. Many of these games, while familiar on the surface, were experimenting with some less than traditional mechanics. Often pivoting from the genre's focus on turn-based combat and slow-paced narrative, they would opt for a less orthodox RPG approach. Of the Xbox 360's JRPGs, few represent the genre's bygone era, quite like the twin works of development studio Mistwalker. Blue Dragon and Lost Odyssey were a statement in the rapidly changing landscape of genres, and the game industry more broadly. There's still a place for the old guard, there's still a hunger for traditional turn-based JRPGs. This was the unspoken code of Mistwalker. With the world of RPGs in flux at the time, it was hard to know whether or not this code would hold water. Now, with the Xbox 360's 20th birthday only a couple of years out, yes, really, the benefit of hindsight tells us that Mistwalker was correct. Many of the past decade's most beloved RPGs wear time-tested influences on their sleeve, and the indie market proves that the niche isn't going anywhere. The hunger that Mistwalker vowed to address with its games has never gone away. History has proven them right. But what of their games? Lost Odyssey in particular, while a traditional JRPG, was an ambitious one. An epic tale with hours of cutscenes, a complex skill system, and production values buttressed with Microsoft funding. It was a big deal, but it's never really found a second wind the way many genre classics do. Some say it's shamelessly derivative, some say it's a decent love letter to the RPGs of yore, some say it's a slept-on masterpiece that never got its due. In the vast world of RPGs, be they J, W, A, C, T, D, or MMO, few individuals are held in such esteem as Hironobu Sakaguchi. Hired at Square in 1983, he was assigned to a number of low-level projects, working his way up the ladder until in 1986, he persuaded his bosses to take a chance on a bold idea. Inspired by Wizardry, Ultima, and Dragon Quest, Sakaguchi and his small team developed a game that would be called Final Fantasy. It was an unexpectedly massive success, which transformed Square into an industry titan. The success of Final Fantasy and its subsequent follow-ups turned Sakaguchi into a miniature gaming rock star. This in a time when developers' efforts weren't often recognized on an individual level. Fellow Square alumni Yoshinori Kitase and Tetsuya Nomura described Sakaguchi as Square's central creative voice. Sakaguchi became a de facto representative in a time when it seemed like the company could do no wrong, acting as executive producer for success after success. Yet, as anyone who's paid attention to the video game industry knows, nobody is bulletproof, no matter their prior success. Whether we're talking about Square in the 1990s or Square Enix today, the company has long had a firm grip on state-of-the-art 3D cutscenes. Creatively weaving in-game storytelling with these pre-rendered sequences, Square won a lot of acclaim for their cutting-edge, nearly Hollywood-quality cutscenes. With the company growing exponentially, the thought presented itself. Nearly Hollywood? Why contain it? Why not penetrate the film market? With the massive success of CGI films like Toy Story and the enduring legacy of Final Fantasy among young adults, a fully 3D animated film aimed at a more mature demographic seemed like a logical step. A team within Square created a proof of concept titled The Grey Project, which was well received. A department was formed within Square to commence production on a film, and things would quickly become complicated. A department for in-game cutscenes was all well and good, but the minutiae involved in a feature-length film demanded more employees, more workstations, and more floor space. Seeing this as an opportunity to formally branch into multimedia production, Square, at no small expense, opened up the offices of Square Pictures in Hawaii. With a massive investment on the line, Square placed the film's directorial duties on Hironobu Sakaguchi, who shouldered them willingly. Like several of the games he directed, Sakaguchi would pull from his real-world experiences in order to pen the concept for the film, which would come to be known as Final Fantasy: The Spirits Within. While excitement levels for the film were high, the production process seemed to be one step forward, two steps back. Square Pictures' international 200-person team was wading into entirely new territory for the film industry. This involved numerous issues with motion capture, rendering pipeline delays, and perhaps most significantly, a budget that was rapidly swelling out of control. $137 million, and 4 years later, Final Fantasy: The Spirits Within was 2001's most catastrophic box office bomb, with a comparably tepid critical reception. I'm not here to judge whether or not The Spirits Within is a great movie. Whether casting Steve Buscemi in a Final Fantasy movie is a hilarious misstep or a stroke of creative genius, well, that's for you to decide.
Excuse me, Doc, but what friggin' relationship?
The relevant story here is the one taking place in Square's own offices. Their impending merger with Enix was delayed due to financial uncertainty they hadn't experienced since their pre-Final Fantasy days. The $45 million Square Pictures studio was shuttered, and Square's Hollywood ambitions sank to the bottom of the sea. While Sakaguchi wasn't fired, he felt utterly dejected, and in a greater sense, creatively unfulfilled. In 2003, preceding the movie's fallout, Sakaguchi resigned from Square. This marked the end of an era. For several years following his resignation, Sakaguchi was in a state of listlessness. His personal fulfillment had been based entirely on his work, and without that creative outlet, he was demoralized. Even if he rejoined Square, he'd likely only have administrative work and informal mentorship roles thrust upon him. After much reflection, he became motivated to return to the gaming industry and create an original property for the first time in many years. He called up his artist friends, Akira Toriyama of Dragon Ball fame, and Takehiko Inoue, author of Vagabond. Newly energized and excited for the future, the three of them agreed to go into business, and Mistwalker was born. Immediately, the two artists respectively began collaborating with Sakaguchi, Toriyama contributing to what would become Blue Dragon, and Inoue to Lost Odyssey. Mistwalker's method of development is somewhat out of the ordinary compared to most of the studios I've covered on my channel. Rather than making their games entirely in-house, the company acts as a co-developer with other studios. Most of the creative and directorial guidance would be provided by Mistwalker, while their co-studio would handle the actual software development. It was a unique approach, but one that Microsoft enthusiastically agreed to fund. While the windfall was no doubt appreciated by Mistwalker, there was a risk assumed by both parties. Financially, Microsoft was going out on a limb, but developing a JRPG for the Xbox 360 was a gamble of its own. The PlayStation 3 was massively successful in Japan, and comparatively speaking, Microsoft had no presence to speak of. The partners' hopes would lie in two possibilities. Either Western audiences would turn out for traditional single-player RPGs, or those same RPGs would give Japanese audiences a reason to buy an Xbox 360. Mistwalker's first game, Blue Dragon, released in December of 2006. The 360, having been rushed to market, was desperately in need of games, period, never mind RPGs, of which the console was experiencing a drought. Microsoft cleverly bundled the game with an Xbox 360 system, driving both hardware and software sales in Japan. Adorning the game's cover and promotional material, Akira Toriyama's signature art was a breath of fresh air in a landscape dominated by more grounded, dark, and complicated RPGs. Games like Ace Combat 6, 99 Nights, and Dead or Alive 4 had bolstered 360 console sales enough to establish some kind of presence in Japan. By the time Blue Dragon dropped, sales met expectations, which was, as they say in the industry, good enough. Reviews were largely positive, with the game serving the precise purpose for which it had been developed, a return to a simpler time in RPGs. There was hope for Microsoft's life abroad, and there was hope for Mistwalker. Their next game, Lost Odyssey, had already been in development for several years at this point. It was being co-created with Feel Plus, a studio whose staff included several experienced developers. Their prior work included games like Legend of Dragoon and Shadow Hearts. Hey, I covered both of those on my channel. Isn't it nice to know you'll have something to watch when this video is over? Unlike the lighthearted Blue Dragon, Sakaguchi aimed to tell a deeply moving and more personal story with Lost Odyssey. Production values amped up, and the number of staff members working on the game greatly increased. The question remains, how did Lost Odyssey fare? Well, let's take a look, shall we? The first thing to note is that the game is a whopping 4 discs. In case you're not familiar, Xbox 360's dual-layer DVDs could only hold about 9 GB of space, compared to the 50 of a dual-layered Blu-ray disc. This means a lot of story or cutscene-heavy 360 games came on multiple discs. Now, if like me, you had a 20 GB launch Xbox, you'd have a grand old time uninstalling and reinstalling Lost Odyssey discs depending on where you were in the story. Of course, you could play the game without installing it, but I'd recommend bringing a Jughead Double Digest to read during the battle transitions. You'll have a lot of downtime. Now, with the power of backwards compatibility, all subsequent generations of Xbox can play Lost Odyssey with improved load times. The system just emulates the game, which also means you don't have to swap discs out at all. There's probably no reason I'd ever buy an Xbox One but for Lost Odyssey, so thank you to my patrons. The game kicks off with an excellent CGI cutscene of 2 opposing factions, Ura and Gotza, going to war. Between the sound quality and lack of video compression, you really get a sense for why this game came on 4 discs. As things begin to look grim for Ura, a lone swordsman, a cut above the rest, appears to take on Gotza's siege machines. Can you guess who the protagonist is gonna be? It's a very clever transition from cutscene to gameplay that showcases how old RPG formats can be spiced up with the advance in technology. It even transitions back to CG smoothly once the battle is over. This opening is meant to introduce you to the game's combat. As I'd mentioned earlier, it's a very traditional turn-based style, especially at present. Throughout the game, the combat will evolve in ways that elevate it beyond the simple back and forth, but for now, things are real simple. Eventually, a massive shadow is cast over the soldiers as a meteor spilling out magma decimates the front lines and beyond. All have perished, but one, Kaim, our main character. Kaim is a commander in the Uran army. He's an austere person who doesn't seem grateful to have survived the blast. He's also not very good at expressing himself when he's angry. Yet he's an excellent soldier, and that's enough for the Republic of Ura, where Kaim returns to give his report. The world of Lost Odyssey is one of science fantasies with guns, vehicles, and high-tech machinery. It's all powered by the recently discovered magic energy, and Ura's level of magic industry is a cut above. There are massive pendulums generating power for high-speed trams and giant television screens. Conceptually, it's familiar for RPG fans, especially those who have played Sakaguchi's previous works. Yet they took advantage of the Xbox 360's hardware capabilities, really showing off an imposing sense of scale in real-time 3D. There's also a heavy dose of foreshadowing, as characters in this game are literally incapable of talking about magic energy without sinister music playing in the background.
This power came to be called magic energy. Even now, there are none who can explain why this power, a power that merely lay buried within all living creatures, suddenly flourished as it did.
Whatever the case, Ura's become the center of industry, with all of the advantages and growing pains that come with it. Lost Odyssey, unlike a lot of other RPGs of the time, retains the fixed perspective of Square's older RPGs. You're allowed to move the camera a little bit and even zoom in if you're really struck by an artistic impulse. Maybe we shouldn't look at these textures too close. You can also run at Mach speeds, pass the old kobold skin around, and kick the shit out of garbage cans. The thing about garbage cans is surprisingly important. This game is absolutely crammed full of items hidden in the environment. In any given screen throughout the game, there's potentially like 7 items that you haven't seen yet, so you're actually obligated to go around kicking garbage cans before doing anything else. Excuse me, I think you're supposed to recycle these? All of this to say, the game world is static like a classic RPG, but there's more environmental interaction than you might expect. It's a good idea to head down alleyways and talk to NPCs. You might find something for the lost and found, or even little career activities, among other things we'll talk about later. Eventually, Kaim reports to Ura's council chairman, Roxian.
Tell me, how did you survive?
I don't know.
Up until very recently, Ura was a monarchy, but in order to keep up with the blistering pace of societal change, they've since shifted to a republic. We learn more about Kaim as well. A council member named Gongora has cast a spell on Kaim, which supposedly makes him immortal, but it's cost him his memory. What? Oh, okay. At this point, making a joke about a JRPG with an amnesiac protagonist would be so trite, you know? I got nothing to give here. According to Gongora, the spell is more of a curse than a blessing. As such, he wishes to keep the circumstances surrounding it a mystery. Kaim is assigned a mission by Roxian. Ura has been constructing a structure called Grand Staff under Gongora's supervision. It's meant to harness massive quantities of magic energy. Communications with Grand Staff suddenly ceased, which has the council assuming the worst. But with an immortal on the case, they'd have nothing to worry about. Thus, Kaim is sent along with another of Gongora's immortals, a woman named Seth Balmore. She's less dour than Kaim, although she's lost her memory as well.
When we met before, were we enemies? Or allies? Or maybe even lovers?
After the two set off, Gongora is placed under house arrest until the investigation is finished. He'd acted as advisor to Ura's previous king until he passed. Even though Ura no longer has a king, he's still loyal to the would-be crown prince, Tolton, who's upset at the council for besmirching Gongora's character. Gongora's increasingly menacing character is just something about dark Guy Fieri that rubs me the wrong way. Gongora sends a magician named Jansen with Kaim and Seth, believing that he'll be helpful. Jansen's introduction is quite something.
You're gonna have to give me a little bit more, you know what I'm saying? Wow! Whoa, hey, okay, that's some serious mojo, buddy. Easy, easy.
And so two immortals with no memory and a seedy magician get to work for a man who looks like an alcoholic stepdad. The pieces are all set up. At this point, I'd like to talk about the visuals, the highs and the lows. The game runs on Unreal Engine 3. There's a stigma attached to this generation of Unreal Engine, and not for nothing. Games made on it were often very brown, and very green, and very gray. There's also a heavy use of the bloom lighting effect, giving materials a sometimes unnatural sheen. There's also the trademark texture pop-in, as well as a lot of aliasing on console games made with the engine. Now, there are some excellent looking Unreal 3 games, so a lot of these problems are attributable to art departments rather than just the engine itself. Still, many games, in spite of their best efforts, retain that classic Unreal 3 look, and Lost Odyssey falls victim to this in some areas. I'm just not at the point where I can be nostalgic over Unreal 3. If anything, I'd be nostalgic over MT Framework, and even in that case, I'm not there yet. There's just something about the material quality and the way that Unreal 3's lighting works that gives much of the game a glossy, plasticky look that it just can't shake. To be real nitpicky, I also find the UI design is very bland and built purely for function. You can't even change the color of the boxes. It's gray till the end, like the game wants you to be depressed. Well, it does, but at least let me have the blue text box. Conversely, there are some ways in which Lost Odyssey stands the test of time beautifully. The character designs by Takahiko Inoue are excellent. They successfully translate to 3D in a way that much concept art doesn't. The overall level of detail in scenes, including flora, fauna, and background details, is really a step above what you might expect. While the game is very brown and gray like many Unreal 3 products from this time, the yarn that Lost Odyssey spins is often downcast, so the muted palette does suit the game's tone. Still, there are scenes that would benefit from more saturation. The aliasing, particularly on HD displays, also leads to some very ugly and distracting shimmering, especially when combined with bloom lighting on reflective materials. Most of Lost Odyssey's visual issues are technical in nature, and playing the game on the Xenia emulator proves that to be the case. The 15-year-old game cleans up very nicely with high resolution and anti-aliasing. Unfortunately, there's so many glitches in the emulated version that it's still not the definitive way to play. But I think it looks great at times and goes to show how seamless an HD remaster would be. While playing Lost Odyssey for long periods of time, you may find the drab dungeons and murky depth of field effects getting to you, but in a very general sense the game holds up. That's largely thanks to the design department. They went out of their way to make each area of the game feel distinct in terms of architecture, costumes, culture, and even the traits of the individuals living there. The smooth frame rate helps as well. Well, smooth outside of the cutscenes, which we'll talk about later. Rather than using the typical world map structure, you're given a destination selection screen where you can choose where to go. Areas will be barred until you traverse through previous ones or reach key moments in the story. This really restricts your ability to wander around and explore until much later in the game. Area maps themselves are quite simple. Our first destination is the Epsilon Mountains, which is mostly a linear trek forward with a few side areas to grab treasure. Even here, I'm not spared the scourge of the pots. Oh no, trees too? I gotta start checking every tree. While staying the night in an abandoned building, we get a flashback showing Gongora plotting, which is something he does a lot in this game.
If either Kaim or Seth seem like they're starting to regain even a fragment of their memories, use this.
He had given Jansen a magical stone and told him to throw it at Kaim or Seth if it seemed like either of them were regaining their memories. A forget-me-now, as it were.
So easy to forget. Stupid forgetful Michael.
In fact, it seems like Kaim in particular has been seeing fragments of his memories through dreams. The key difference between Kaim and Seth at this point is that while Seth desperately wants to regain her memories, Kaim has no such desire. He sees memories as painful, a weakness, and thus runs from his past with no desire to know who he is or where he came from. This suits Gongora just fine, who, for various plotting-related reasons, wants to keep the Immortals as a blank slate. While Tolton dines at home, Gongora, breaking house arrest, barges into his dining room and stops him from eating poisoned soup.
Had you not come, I would have ended up like that mouse.
He assumes the assassination attempt must be from an anti-monarchist, yet Tolton himself has no desire to restore the monarchy. In fact, the only one who does is Gongora, so is it any surprise that it was all a big false flag on his part? You know, the more I hear about this Gongora guy, the less I care for him. Our party reaches Grand Staff, which has been suffering from some problems, including a magic energy leak which some bugs have been feasting on. This leads us into a boss fight and a great opportunity to talk about Lost Odyssey's combat system in depth. If you'll recall, I'd mentioned that several developers from Legend of Dragoon and Shadow Hearts were involved in the development team. I don't know if it's a coincidence or not, but like in those games, Lost Odyssey has something of a timing-based button press system in its battles. Throughout the game, you'll find rings which can be equipped on your party members. As long as a character has a ring on, their melee attacks will start a timing-based minigame where you have to hold the right trigger and release it when the larger ring overlaps with the smaller ring. Rings themselves can cause bonus damage, increase critical chance, and cause status debuffs, among many other things. As long as you successfully time your release of the trigger, the effect of the ring will be applied to your melee attack. Getting a good is good, but getting a perfect is perfect, because it'll apply the ring's effect more effectively. It's a really simple action battle system. Both LOD's Editions and Shadow Heart's Judgment Ring have more complexity and variability to them. Still, I'm always a fan of these types of systems because they engage you. Even if it's in the smallest way possible, you can't just robotically move through fights, nor should you want to. If anything, I think the system would be improved if it were more complex, maybe have more sequences of presses to get through or incorporating controls beyond the triggers. Also, because the ring triggers only with melee attacks, the party's spellcasters, which comprises about half of the potential cast, basically just don't benefit from rings at all. With very few exceptions, there's no point in the game where it's better for spellcasters to be attacking than casting spells. I feel like the ring's effects could have easily been applied to spells as well, at least in some capacity. This would have kept things more consistently interesting. I understand there's a risk of annoying the player as well, since not everybody likes these types of battle systems. But like, you can just not press the button, you know? Seeing the word bad pop up may be a nuclear strike to the ego, but you can just close your eyes and wait for your turn to be over. Your party of 5 can be arranged in the formation of your choosing, with melee users predictably being better on the front row and spellcasters in the back. A noteworthy feature that separates Lost Odyssey from other turn-based games is the GC system, which is pretty critical in some fights. GC, or guard condition, represents your front row's ability to deflect damage from the back row. If the GC is high, back row characters will suffer little damage. If the GC is empty, being in the back row provides no real benefit. The GC itself directly correlates with how much HP your front row has combined, so it'll lower over time as enemies chip away at your front row's health. While it can't be regained by healing, there are certain special abilities that will bring it back, at least a little bit. Your enemies have a GC gauge of their own, meaning you can't freely attack the back row unless you're willing to sacrifice efficiency. Aside from chipping away at it the old-fashioned way, there are also certain special abilities that allow you to outright ignore the enemy's GC. This can be valuable if you're trying to pick off an annoying spellcaster in the back row, for instance. While the battle system is very familiar, there's a higher level of strategy in the tougher fights than you might expect. For instance, some spells or abilities can take multiple turns to fire off. You might have another character learn the casting support ability, which sacrifices their turn but hastens the chosen spell by a full turn. Many of the game's spells aren't learned from leveling up, but found in the environment or purchased from stores. This makes it all the more critical to search every screen in the game. Thundaga might be in one of these garbage cans. Perhaps the most interesting thing about Lost Odyssey's combat is its skill system. Throughout the game, you'll recruit a number of characters. Some will be immortal and some won't. The mortal characters have predetermined rules and will learn spells or abilities at set levels. The immortal characters, however, have more of a parasitic role to the mortal characters. Immortals can learn spells, skills, and abilities through 2 potential means. The first of these is skill linking. Each immortal can select one skill from a mortal to learn over a period of time determined by the skill's SP goal, a resource earned from battles. For example, Jansen will learn how to use higher level black magic at certain points. And now, if I want Seth to learn black magic, I can skill link his level 4 black magic to Seth, and then later on level 5 black magic, and so on and so forth. After gaining enough SP, Seth will permanently learn how to use black magic. I could do the same thing with Kaim if I wanted him to learn Seth's steel command. The only caveat is that both the character learning and the character being learned from need to be in the active party. The thing is, just knowing the skill isn't enough. You also need to apply the skill to an immortal skill slot, of which there's a finite amount. You gain skill slots by leveling up immortal characters, or by having them consume rare items called slot seeds. So you can't just sequentially learn every skill from every single character, because sooner or later you're gonna run out of slots. I want to make room for ailment resistance, but Magic Seal sounds like everything I've ever wanted from a video game. This means characters are still encouraged to focus on particular strengths, which is a good way of limiting how useful immortal characters can be. The second method of learning new skills is through the use of accessories. Each accessory comes with some kind of a boon. Like skill linking, it can be learned and permanently applied to immortal characters. Mortal characters get the short end of the stick here, since while accessory effects do apply to them, they can't be learned permanently as with immortals. Some accessories can be seen on characters, which is always something I appreciate. Kneel before your king, cretins. Now, not since Shadow Hearts have I seen a game so robust with accessories. There are accessories for pretty much every situation you can imagine, which is just as well because a lot of fights will demand certain skills or status nullifications. The downside of immortals learning skills from equipment is that, between the 4 of them, the mortals are very often left with the lousier stuff. Because you're encouraged to always have the immortals learning new skills, you'll usually just equip the mortal characters with something less relevant to the situation. So despite the immediate simplicity of the battle mechanics, the systems that Lost Odyssey lets you play around with do add a fair amount of variety. I'm a big fan of modular skill systems, a la Final Fantasy Tactics or FF7's Materia system. Lost Odyssey never pushes into that level of potential insanity, but you can still invite some chaos into the battles as the game goes on. More on that later. For now, let's talk about Bogimoray. I know you've experienced it, booting up a new RPG, getting the hang of the battle system, reach the first real boss, Utter humiliation. Matador is actually super easy. Okay, you know what? You're cooler than everybody else, and we're all gonna cheer for you, carry you out on our shoulders, like Teen Wolf, okay? But for most of us, this situation has occurred at least once. Lost Odyssey's first real boss is this creature called the Grilgan, and it's a surprisingly tough fight, to give Grilgan its due. You need to make sure you're well stocked on items, taking advantage of elemental weaknesses, and spending several turns healing in anticipation of damage rather than as a reaction to it. But none of the enemies, Grilgan included, can prepare you for Bogimoray. Search its name on Google and you'll come across droves of 15-year-old forum posts screaming, "Bogimoray!" in a frustrated hysteria. The reality of Bogimoray and many of the game's bosses is that there are specific avenues to take in order to achieve an easier victory. You might call them puzzle bosses, but I think it's more accurate to call them gimmick bosses, and not in a bad way either. In Bogimoray's case, I'm sure I've said that name wrong 5 times now, you have to keep an eye on its charge meter at the top left of the screen. Magical insects are summoned which spend their turns contributing magic energy to the bog. It's important to take them out quickly because if that meter fills, he'll use an attack called Paraflare, which deals massive damage and, more importantly, causes paralysis. Early on in the area leading up to this fight, you find the Yellow Band, an accessory which grants immunity from paralysis. This is a massive hint. You have 2 immortals who can learn paralysis immunity. Equip that skill and then give the band to Jansen. Boom, all 3 characters are now protected against the most dangerous variable in the fight. The thing is, you might not be thinking about the skill system all that hard yet. Even though the game winks and nudges at you, you're just getting your feet wet and you may not anticipate a need for anti-paralysis. You'll find many of the boss encounters are preceded by some kind of specific accessory in this game, and the Bogimoray fight is the game's way of getting your attention. This fight can be a pretty brutal shit test even if most or all of your characters are protected against paralysis. If none of them are, it's as good as a lost cause, which is where I think most of this boss fight induced trauma came from. If you know what you're doing and you're smart about item use, the fight is perfectly manageable. The game expects a degree of trial and error, which is probably why save points are almost always right before a boss. The fact that you can equip any accessory at any time is proof of this. Once the boss is finished, the party is able to investigate Grand Staff, at least for a short time.
If you get any closer, I will shoot!
This is General Kokonis. He may not be the most important character in this game, but he's the most important to me.
Our own troops are in the line of fire. Well, then they better be able to dodge arrows. Move!
Kokonis leads the military of Numara, a peaceful nation who backs neither Ura nor Gotza in the ongoing conflict. He and his troops confront the party, who set off a magical explosion in order to escape, with poor results. They end up captured on a Numaran battleship. Jansen uses Gongora's memory marble to trick the guards, and thus begins the stealth sequence. You know the one, you've played it before. It's stiff, dysfunctional, and forces you to replay large sections of the game when you fail. Why did I do that? Why did I do that? I knew that would happen. Why did I do that? While traversing the ship, the party finds out that Ming, the Queen of Numara herself, is actually aboard. Jansen decides to shoot his shot.
I didn't pay my respects. I mean, I'd have to turn in my man card.
Okay, let's talk a little bit about Jansen. When I first played Lost Odyssey, I was around 15 years old. I thought Jansen was hilarious. Now my thoughts on Jansen are a bit more complicated. Where before I thought he was just a funny ladies' man, now I find him just kind of annoying. Which is good, because I think that's what the game wants you to see him as.
You know, I thought he'd say that, my lord. His shoes, hello?
He talks too much, his punchlines often don't land, and he's kind of a nuisance. It's like looking into a mirror. Sometimes I just want him to shut the fuck up, as does Kaim, as does Seth.
I couldn't sleep. I'm usually exercising, sparring with people, and I work out a lot before I...
Was that all?
Was what all? About what?
You know what I mean.
Yeah. Well, no, I don't know what you mean. What do you mean?
Jansen, however, is a necessary foil at this stage in the game. His comedic antics bring a lot of levity to the story and situation that's very dry this early on. Kaim and Seth ruminate on their immortality a lot, and that would be a pretty bland dynamic if not for this wrench in the cog. Jansen is being encouraged to double-cross Kaim and Seth, but there is sort of a dorky innocence and curiosity to him that makes him endearing. If nothing else, it makes us question how loyal he actually is to Gongora. More than anything, I have to commend his English voice actor, Michael McGahern. He doesn't have many credits to his name, but his performance is absolutely bang on for Jansen in this game. I can't imagine hearing him in any other language.
Leave this to me. I'm an expert in tonology.
McGahern was told to heavily improvise during his scenes in order to make Jansen his own. His background involved improv theater as well as stand-up comedy, which makes him a perfect fit for this character. There's something incredibly unique about his line delivery. He rushes through dialogue, stumbling on words, with awkwardness just bubbling out of him.
You're going to tell me what Ura is plotting.
Well, see, now there's no surprise. They were going to throw your birthday party. Where's the queen?
Most of the other characters are calculating each word, but Jansen, with his unfounded confidence, is just winging it. That helps him come across as more natural. Jansen, unlike many RPG characters, feels like a guy who could exist. You almost find yourself liking him, and then he puts Ming to sleep, starts kidnapping her, and alerts the entire ship to their escape. I do have to commend him for maintaining eye contact throughout their entire conversation. That took self-control. Oh, Jansen, come on now. Now, this scene is a bit strange. He puts Ming to sleep. Why exactly?
What a woman.
It's easy to assume the worst in light of Jansen being a horn dog, and that possibility would make him irredeemable. Yet we find out later in the story that he's not this person. In fact, immediately after, he shows a great deal of empathy.
Whew. Close one.
You're quite kind, aren't you?
Ming wasn't actually asleep, just evaluating Jansen's intentions, along with the rest of us. Ming's defining characteristic, as explored later on, is her ability to judge one's character, and she judges him favorably here. I know some people talk about the scene as though Jansen were planning on doing something downright unadvisable, but I sincerely believe he was just taking the queen hostage to give the party leverage as fugitives. The party arrives in Numara, and much to Kakana's chagrin, they're freed and allowed to wander the city. Numara is a far sight less depressing than the city of Ura thanks to the benevolent rule of Queen Ming, who herself is immortal as well. Seth has memories of interacting with her many years ago, but the context still eludes her, and Ming doesn't seem to recognize the party at all. The kingdom's war neutrality, however, doesn't suit General Kakana's interests, who considers Numara to be in a frail and insignificant state. Believing the party to be spies, he has his men trail Kaim, hopefully learning something about Ura's grand staff in the process. This against Ming's wishes. She wants Numara to remain peaceful and neutral, but with meteorites mysteriously falling on battlefields, that may not be tenable for long. Lost Odyssey, for much of its runtime, is very sparse on side quests. The few activities on offer are simple and usually result in crafting materials as a reward. Rings can be assembled and upgraded in the main menu using different components. There are even ring makers in the major cities that can combine different materials to make powerful rings, although you'll have to wait for some of the better ones later on. You're inundated with crafting materials from the beginning of the game, and by the end it especially falls flat as a reward. First of all, the best rings in the beginning are almost always increased damage rings. Most of the bosses are immune to status effects, and it's better to just dish out extra damage to standard enemies. So you end up with a pretty wide array of rings, and almost none of them are all that worth equipping outside of a few exceptions. By the end of the game, you'll have so many incredibly useful rings that most of the crafting materials just become redundant. Many of those materials can be purchased anyway, so some kind of supplementary use for components would have made exploration feel a bit more rewarding. There are a lot of hidden nooks and crannies in Numara, and the best of the items you'll find while poking around are slot seeds. Also, as a really not that relevant aside, I just have to point out that Numara's music reminds me so much of the song Spaghetti Again from Tim and Eric. My mind is diseased. I want to briefly talk about Kaim's character, which I haven't done yet because it's kinda hard. Kaim is a blank slate in the beginning. This is typically a bad thing when you're talking about video game characters, but here at the very least it makes sense. Kaim has no memory, and moreover has no desire to have a memory. The idea of a character who doesn't want to feel emotions has certainly been done. It has the capacity to come across as grim, dark, or edgy, which can undermine the seriousness with which you're supposed to take a character. Kaim isn't really like that, though. He certainly has an aloofness, which when combined with his unreal swordsmanship, could come across a bit Cold Steel the Hedgehog, but that's not the case for long. While walking around Numara, the party comes across a pair of siblings, a young girl named Cook and an even younger boy named Mac.
Did you plant these flowers?
Nuh-uh. They're just flowers that grow around here. Mom says they're really rare.
They tend to a garden of tender flora, rare and beautiful flowers that die almost immediately after being picked. They introduce the party to their deathly ill mother, a woman named Liram, who turns out to be Kaim's daughter.
They've let me see you one more time.
He thought he lost her decades ago, or rather, he would have thought that had he retained his memory. But seeing her again, a large piece of that memory comes flooding back to him. She had jumped to her presumed death, and Kaim had seen neither her nor her mother, his wife Sarah, since then. Kaim and Liram's reunion is short and bittersweet. Her illness has progressed to the point of being on death's door.
I know, Liram. I know. Liram! No, don't go. I'll bring Sarah here, I swear. Hang on, Liram.
Mom! Mom, no!
This is not the first time Lost Odyssey has choked me up, and it is far, far from the last. This moment reveals a new dimension to Kaim's character. Up until now, he was closed off, stoic, and unfeeling. Not only is this Kaim's first show of emotion, but he openly weeps, grieving for the second time with his grandchildren over a daughter he didn't even know was alive. The scene is heartbreaking, brought to life with excellent voice work, and of course, Nobuo Uematsu's incredible score, which we're not done discussing. From this point forward, Kaim is a changed man. Having surrendered himself to emotion this once, he's no longer the person we knew. This intense sadness that Kaim feels is at the very core of the story Lost Odyssey is trying to tell. Kaim is an immortal, someone who can never die. There are innumerable pieces of fiction in which a foolhardy villain seeks eternal life. It's the prize of prizes, a cure for the one thing which ails every living person. But the angle from which Lost Odyssey approaches immortality is one of deep and endless pain. Kaim has lived for 1,000 years. In that time, he's seen countless friends, loved ones, and even his own children grow old and die if they were lucky enough to reach old age. He's seen towns that he's called home leveled to the ground in countless wars. It's hard to put across just what immortality looks like, but Lost Odyssey's solution is surprisingly simple. 1,000 years of dreams. As Kaim explores the world, meets new people, and overhears discussions, fragments of memories from ages past come back to him in the form of dreams. These are represented in-game as short stories. The stories were penned by Kiyoshi Shigematsu, an esteemed Japanese writer, and there are 31 of these in all. I have a confession to make. Back when I played Lost Odyssey at like 15, give or take, I didn't care for these stories at all. I found them to be speed bumps in my progression through the game. I mean, who wants to constantly stop and read a short story while they're trying to play a game? Oh, what a fool I was. I don't know if it's just the patience that comes with age or the experience I've gained in the almost 15 years since then, but these stories are tremendously valuable to Lost Odyssey's overall experience. They hold a special place in my heart, and it seems I'm not alone in that. The premise is simple. Kaim travels the world, he sees things that remind him of events that took place in his life, and we get to re-experience the event along with him. From a quality perspective, suffice to say that the stories are excellent and written very well. They were localized by Jay Rubin, a professional translator of no small repute. Having translated the works of Haruki Murakami, an internationally acclaimed author, to English, he was uniquely positioned to bring the fragile subjects and elegant prose to a Western audience. While the stories incorporate Kaim's perspective, it almost feels like an outsider looking in, as though hundreds of years separating each story result in a Kaim who isn't quite the same person as he was back then. Like he's floating above himself, seeing the events for what they are with 1,000 years of hindsight. The first dream you'll unlock, and one of very few non-optional stories, is called Hannah's Departure. Kaim has returned many times to an inn on his travels. He knows the family there, and has always regaled their sick daughter, Hannah, with his travel stories, which she's loved. Now, Hannah is breathing her last breaths. Kaim has arrived to the inn just in time to tell her stories of the ocean, the sky, and the cities that he's visited. He doesn't tell her about the gruesome battles he's fought in and the friends he's seen killed. As these stories illustrate, Kaim has seen death so many times, he intuitively understands how long the dying have left and what they need to hear to ease their pain. These stories are very often tearjerkers, demonstrating the incalculable sadness that comes with never being allowed to die. The music is always wonderful, and the few graphical elements on screen add a nice level of atmosphere without imposing upon the player's imagination. Music, sound effects, and faint images heighten your connection to the setting, giving you brief glimpses into Kaim's experience. You're always given emotional space, and those presentational elements don't cross the line into manipulative territory. Not every story is sad. Some are meant to inspire beauty and appreciation for life. Some pull the rug out from under you with cruel or ironic twists. Almost all of the 1,000 Years of Dream stories are so granular they're almost mundane in their subject matter. But it's a perfect excuse to show Kaim's perspective and add depth to his character while keeping the plot on pace. You'd think that stories about an immortal warrior who's lived for 1,000 years would be epic and grand in scope, but the stories often find their meaning in particularities. The fleeting nature of conversations we have with strangers, the yearning for adventure you feel when raised in a small town. My personal favorite story is about a man who's served as Kaim's shoemaker for many years. It's about the loss that's felt when an artisan and friend can no longer fill the role they've had in your life for so long. Because Kaim has lived for so long and seen so much, the simple joys and grievances of mortals are just threads in the tapestry that is his limitless life. Our short lives are full of beauty that's so easily taken for granted. When one has nothing but time, they're afforded the luxury of deep reflection and wisdom with it. The stories that Kaim holds onto from his journeys are often rooted in the absurdity that we face but don't recognize every day. From our daily rituals that bring us some transient pleasure to the uncertainties that plague us despite our inability to control them. Kaim sees these, recognizes them, and in many respects envies the mortal ability to feel them. Recollections from 5, 50, or 500 years ago are triggered by familiar sights or words, and that's Kaim's tenuous link to his own humanity. Perhaps that's why he spends so much of the game desperately trying to run away from his lost memories, because it's better to feel nothing than to feel everything endlessly. If the inevitable end of joy is grief, and if that grief is everlasting, then perhaps it's best to feel no joy at all, or so Kaim thinks until he is able to feel again. He feels the pain of losing a child intensely, and not for the first or probably last time. But the joyfulness of being reunited with her, however briefly, and getting to meet his grandchildren brings about a new sense of purpose and determination in his life.
The first time she died, my heart was filled with despair. The second time she died, though, it wasn't despair that filled my heart. It was hope.
You'll find in these 1,000 Years of Dreams that Kaim finds purpose in living for others, since he has a limitless supply of living to offer them. Sacrificing his life or his time would be an impossible gesture, but he can sacrifice apathy. He makes the world a harder place for himself to live in, but a better place for others. Almost every dream Kaim has involves the teaching of other people, and often the unexpected learning from those 1,000 years his junior. It could be this is reflected in-game through the fact that immortals always have the capacity to learn from their mortal counterparts. The more he dreams, the more it seems life has intrinsic value because it ends. Like a tender flora being picked, its beauty is intense but fleeting. Kaim will go on lamenting the fact that he can't die, but he can help shoulder the burdens of others, learning from them eternally and finding meaning in that long life. If there's one thing for which Lost Odyssey should be lauded, it's taking something as simple as a short story collection and turning it into an awesome feature. There's much to appreciate about these stories and the perspective they offer. Even if you don't plan on playing Lost Odyssey, I have to recommend you find the collection on YouTube and read through them. They are simply spectacular. With Lyram's passing, the party as well as Cook and Mac begin to make funeral arrangements. Meanwhile, in Ura, Tolton is attacked by Roxian while paying respects to his father.
Wait! Was the poison soup you're doing? Chairman! Answer me!
Forced into self-defense, Tolton kills Roxian as Gongora shows up conveniently at the 11th hour. Gongora tells Tolton that they must find a way to sweep this under the rug, or else people will assume that it was a political assassination. Tolton, with little life experience and implicit trust in his advisor, agrees to let him handle it. But it was a plot. Roxian wasn't actually Roxian, but a lifelike golem created by Gongora who goes on to kill the real Roxian. The citizens of Ura are led to believe he died in an accident, thus creating a power vacuum that will surely be filled by only the noblest and stoutest of heart. With their collective memories returning, Kaim and Seth believe that Gongora somehow robbed them of their past. In what capacity and to what end, they don't know, but they vow to find out. At this point, you have to collect materials for Lyram's funeral, which is not a particularly exciting section of the game, but it is one that makes a statement. Lost Odyssey is the kind of game where you have to collect quest items in order to hold the main character's daughter's funeral. As uninteresting as this part is mechanically, it left an impression on me, and it's one of the few parts of the game I remembered many years later. There's just this air of deep sadness and uncertainty, which is really heightened by the gray, overcast sky. Mac and Cook, by the way, are fantastic. Adults voicing children often phone it in, but their performances are absolutely bang on. Their enthusiasm, Mac's propensity to burst into tears, and their sibling relationship, these types of things are, like Jansen's performance, strangely natural and not stiff like children usually are in RPGs. It's hard to write kids in media, and that's especially true for RPGs. In these games, dialogue is sequential and informative, but kids, God love them, are neither of those things. They step on each other's words, they stutter, they're curious but not stupid. Well, you know, some kids are stupid, but it's not a hard and fast rule.
Jason, wait for me. Wait for your dad, son.
Mac and Cook really embody that spirit of childhood in a way that sells them as characters. And I mean, come on, Kaim as their grandfather is the most endearing thing I've ever seen. After the funeral, Mac runs away to the Crimson Forest, a place where one supposedly can meet the souls of the dead. Although given that it's been dyed crimson with the blood of the people who were killed here, I can't imagine they mean meet the souls of the dead in a good way. Lost Odyssey's dungeons are nothing to write home about. They're usually very simple mazes with one or two light puzzle elements for you to overcome. For me, they're neither at the worst nor the best end of the RPG dungeon spectrum. I also find that they're usually quite visually uninteresting, with the bulk of dungeons in the game being grayish caves or brownish ruins. The Crimson Forest, among some others, is an exception. Where the real annoyance of dungeons comes through is in the game's battle system. The encounter rate in Lost Odyssey actually isn't too bad. However, the fights take a very long time under normal circumstances. Characters are animated extensively, which is good in a way. They look great in fights, spells look nice, there's a lot of enemy variety, and plenty of other visual flourishes which made the game a looker back in 2007. The problem is that the runtime of these animations adds up and makes battles quite lengthy. This isn't a game where you can just attack every enemy, you usually have to engage some level of strategy to end fights quicker, even if those strategies aren't very unique. So, with the game's random battles, you might find yourself somewhat exhausted trying to make it through these areas or doubling back to something you missed. Running away is an option, and there's a skill called Turn Tail which guarantees escape success. The problem is that once you pass the party limit of 5, members not currently in the active party are placed on standby. Most RPGs will dole out experience to unused party members, even if it's only at a reduced rate. Lost Odyssey doesn't do this. Moreover, you'll be forced to use every member at some point in the game, so you can't just leave someone at a much lower level than the rest of the crew. As a matter of fact, one of my scant few memories of Lost Odyssey involved quitting in frustration as I was effectively barred from progressing for this reason. Seeing that part of the game was like unlocking my own 1,000 Years of Dreams, and, while remembering did make me cry, it wasn't in the sad Lost Odyssey way. The way experience points work is a little weird and I'm of two minds about it. There's some diminishing returns going on. Rather than requiring more and more experience to gain levels, as is standard for this type of game, you always require 100 XP to level up in Lost Odyssey. However, the amount of experience you gain is correlative to how difficult the enemies are for your level. A level 28 character might gain 30 experience points for one enemy, while a level 33 character will gain 1 or 2. This makes grinding almost impossible without manipulating the game. This is especially true since you'll immediately stop gaining experience on level up, which gives you a hard cap on how much can be earned at once. In other words, you will never gain more than 1 level per fight, even if the boss is very tough for your level. In theory, this allows the developers to control the ebb, flow, and pacing of the game. Your leveling is throttled or accelerated depending on your environment. This means you as the player don't have to wonder if you're at the right level to take on a challenge. The problem with that is, well, like I said, characters not in the active party don't gain experience. This would be less of a problem if you could swap them in, fight 1 or 2 much higher level enemies, and bring them up to par. But since you only gain 1 level per fight max, you'll have to tag in characters you don't typically use for longer periods of time. That tagging in is a decision that comes front-loaded with potentially dozens of battles. The experience solution can make things much quicker or much slower depending on how often you switch characters out. It also makes some of the later game fights feel less rewarding, as you'll sometimes just gain a couple of experience points for fights that took like 10 minutes. It's got its pros, like being able to curate the difficulty. I only wish that characters outside the team got a share of the experience points. I don't see a good reason to not do that. The Crimson Forest culminates in a boss battle against a malevolent spirit using Mac as a puppet. This is an instance of the quote-unquote gimmick bosses I was talking about earlier. The game allows you to target Mac, but you actually just have to use a newly acquired sleep spell to get him out of the way. The rest of the fight is fairly straightforward, and the scene that follows is fantastic. I am physically incapable of not choking up when this track swells.
What is this? It's a miracle. This is a miracle. It's Mom. Yeah, Mom's here. I know she's here. She heard us. She felt us. Mom, look. We're doing fine, Mom. The warmth of her soul. Liram's brought us a miracle, Kaim.
Keep you in our thoughts.
In a game full of the most stirring cutscenes I've ever watched, this one stands above the others as my absolute favorite. This is where Disc 2 begins. As a result of being possessed, Mac now has access to spirit magic. Cook primarily uses white magic and Jansen black, both of which are self-explanatory. Spirit magic is sort of the wild card of this game. Lots of unusual buffs/debuffs and non-elemental magic damage. One spell called Gamble deals a random amount of physical damage on an enemy, scaling with the user's level. It's easily one of the best spells in the entire game. Either way, Mac and Cook both justify their position in the party. Look at these cute little mage outfits they get now. Aw, look at that oversized wizard collar. Wait, where did you get these? Speaking of pertinent questions, I know there's one on everybody's mind. What happened to General Kakanis? Well, worry not, his coup is going great. When the party returns to Numara, the court sorcerer finds a magical spyglass hidden by Gongora in Jansen's eye. Accused of being spies, the party flees, taking Ming hostage and dealing with some boss fights along the way. The animation for the move Tank Hit will never not make me smile. You can tell Seth desperately wants to move, but since it's a turn-based battle, she's duty-bound to just stand there and get run over by 60 tons of Numaran steel. Taking Ming hostage was the pretense for getting her out of Numara, but the reality is she's just as driven to restore her memory as the other immortals. While the party are forced out of Numara, Ura has problems of its own. With Roxanne passing away from a sudden illness, Tolton decides to re-establish the monarchy, with Gongora as royal advisor. Not only that, but with evidence of Numara's increased militarization, Ura declares the nation as an enemy. It becomes more important than ever that the party find Gongora and stop his various plots. On the upside, you do get a boat at this point, although the degree to which the game opens up is somewhat misleading. The way it works is the boat can be docked at various ports throughout the game. From there, the areas you have access to from the world map selection screen expand. At least they do, depending on how far into the story you are. You're not really given freedom to the level of, say, Chrono Cross after getting the boat. You're still very much railroaded down a particular path, with a few exceptions. This will probably be the point of contention for some people. I personally enjoy having the ability to explore in these games, running around and maybe even getting into trouble. Lost Odyssey keeps you on a very tight leash, and as mentioned, the side content is sparse for most of the game. The boat, at least at this point, almost feels like a pointless gesture. It gets you all excited to explore, and then it's like, well, okay, not really. Not even sure what the point of the jump button is here. Establishing sea dominance, I guess. Now, the party's only able to pilot this ship because of Seth's experience. Prior to having her memory taken by Gongora, she was a well-known pirate. Counter to Kaim, her personality in the early game is much more optimistic and excitable. Her maturity and impatience for bullshit does surface during interactions with Jansen, but for the most part she's good-natured and straightforward. At this point though, we get a somewhat unusual 1,000 Years of Dream story. While the vast majority are dedicated to Kaim, there are a few instances where Seth will remember something about her past. She recalls bits of her pirate's life, mostly with fondness, but for one occasion. In a moment of carelessness, she was knocked unconscious by a rival pirate. She was dragged to the back of a pitch-black cave on a remote island, chained to a boulder, and left there to sit in darkness eternally. Forced into reflection, Seth begins to fear the concept of eternity. Out on the high seas, she has swashbuckling adventures to distract her, but here, in the darkness and silence of the cave, she has nothing but time in the most horrifyingly literal sense. After many hours, days, or even weeks of hopelessness, the cave is illuminated by a bright light. An angelic creature called Anaira, the last of his white-winged species, arrives to comfort and free Seth, having sensed her solitude. Anaira will never find another member of his clan. His life goes on eternally lonely. Thus, he and Seth become fast companions, having found solace in each other's endless, companionless lives. Across the 1,000 Years of Dreams, mostly encompassing Kaim's past, this story is very interesting, particularly the way in which it was written. I'd mentioned that most of Kaim's stories are written from a third-person perspective, but unequivocally having been experienced by Kaim. Seth's dream is written from a first-person perspective, with an uncharacteristically poetic prose considering the Seth we know. For Kaim, it's as if he's on the outside looking in. The stories are called 1,000 Years of Dreams rather than 1,000 Years of Memories, after all. Dreams feel as real as anything while they're happening, but the connection to them fades easily after waking up. Even the dreams which leave the biggest impression are reduced to fragments with time. It can make them feel unreal, as though you have to manually construct your own memories over top of the dreams to keep them from fading away. With Kaim keeping his memories at arm's length, the distance from them and ability to recount the experience directly makes sense. When something is particularly difficult, it only makes sense to disassociate and try to see it for what it was. Seth, on the other hand, has demonstrated an eagerness to regain memories. Her ability to slip into the person she once was is wholly different from Kaim's approach to remembering. The difference between them, as we know it, is that Kaim's most profound memory is losing his daughter, splitting from his wife, and having his life changed for the worse. Seth's profound memory is being saved from her captivity, and more generally, her solitude as a companionless immortal, to have been redeemed. Wherever Anira is, and whatever happened, Seth owes it to him and herself to regain the Seth that was taken by Gongora. With the ocean in a treacherous state, the party can't make it back to Ura. They decide to visit Tosca Village, the place where Kaim and Sarah used to live, to see if they could find any clues as to Sarah's whereabouts. You're given a treasure locator here, which starts as a simple side quest, but one of the few that continues throughout the entire game. Talking to NPCs is really critical because on top of possibly getting items or triggering dreams, they might tell you about the location of a treasure. This usually results in pretty good items or spells, and it's a good reason to initiate dialogue everywhere you go, and it also gives you a purpose to revisit earlier areas. The townsfolk all remember Kaim, who inexplicably looks exactly the same as when he left decades ago. After recruiting Mac and Cook, we already see a much warmer and more personable side to Kaim, especially here chatting with his old buddies in the village. Meanwhile, there's something of a romance blooming between Jansen and Ming, despite his unsuccessful casting of Rufiaga not 2 days ago. The party head to Kaim and Sarah's old house, which has supposedly been occupied by new denizens.
My name is Chris Boris, and I'm the world's first ghost behaviorist. I've come up with a groundbreaking ghost classification system that brings ghostly contact to a whole new level.
The now haunted mansion represents a more intensive puzzle than most of the others in Lost Odyssey. I distinctly remember hating this part when I was younger, but I actually didn't find it so bad now. The music is awesome, the enemy designs are some of the most creative in the game, and the puzzle is simple but effective. You have to step through mirrors to go to a different version of the mansion where objects can be manipulated, and then that carries over to the original world.
Now, an item of this nature can definitely be the root cause of a lot of the problems they're suffering because, one, there could be a lot of spiritual attachments to it, or two...
I think the frustration I originally felt may have come from the enemy encounters, which get longer and longer. We can't just one-hit kill the cannon fodder of the Epsilon Mountains anymore. The enemy parties now consist of many different elemental and damage types, meaning there's not really a one-size-fits-all strategy anymore. This carries over to most of the dungeons in the game. Some enemies will be weak to fire or immune to physical damage, while the back row might have a different property entirely. There's very few target all enemy spells, and the ones that are there are often ineffective, so battles are slow going, one enemy at a time. It drags at times, I won't pretend it doesn't drag, but I don't know, it's not eye-roll worthy like Skies of Arcadia can be. Of course, there's a chance you'll get hopelessly lost or stuck, and yeah, trying to experiment and figure out puzzles with random encounters happening, that shit's annoying. Kind of an unavoidable fact of random encounters. I don't know if I just got really lucky in the directions I chose to go, but I got through the area without too much trouble. At the end of the dungeon, you fight a ghostly enemy who reveals itself to be a possessed Sarah, Kaim's wife. It seems after the profound sadness of losing Lirim, she became prime fodder for the supernatural. Losing their daughter trapped both Kaim and Sarah, but in completely different ways. Together, Mac and Cook sing a lullaby that Lirim used to sing to them, which brings Sarah back into her right mind. Thanks to the extensive journals she's kept, she recognizes Kaim as her husband, despite not remembering much else.
You remember?
No, my memories are gone. But you, I know you're my husband. I know what we left behind in this house. Journal I kept. I know you are Kaim. The only man I've ever loved. I've been waiting for you.
That wasn't in Gongora's plans.
I don't care how crusty and stone-hearted you are, if this game doesn't make you smile or like expel at least one tear, you're not human. At this point, we've recruited all of the immortals, Kaim, Seth, Ming, and Sarah. The four of them share a common history. They all faintly recognize each other, and they've all had memories stolen by Gongora, Ming included. They remember another piece of crucial information at this point. They aren't of this world. They're from somewhere else, sent here to do something very important, but they don't know what. They sense a dark energy coming from the ocean, and so travel to the port town of Samon to see what's going on. Now, Samon is brimming with potential to be a top-tier comfy town. As a trading port, it's cool to see all the different cultural influences in the buildings, the nation's flags displayed in the pub, for instance. The world building is a bit lacking in the game, with few of the NPCs providing broader context, so it's nice to at least have the designs tell you a story about the world. I love the nighttime ambience here, the ornate street lamps, the over-exaggerated European architecture, and the giant clock. As a YouTuber, I'm reticent to offer design advice to any game developer, but if there's anything I say that you should take to heart, let it be this. Clock towers offer a free 2-point bonus to the comfy scale of any town. A 6 out of 10 can become an 8 out of 10 with a well-placed clock tower. It's comfy MSG. The one thing holding Samon back is the fact that everybody is a zombie. Some kind of dark power has taken hold of the townspeople's minds, having them wander around aimlessly. Accordingly, the music track, if you even want to call it that, is built to rob you of comfort. Most uncomfy indeed. A talking crow that gives you random junk for money kind of helps alleviate things, but not by much. A local crew is heading out to investigate the magical disturbance, and the party agrees to join them. On the journey, a bright light washes over the ship, and Seth's dream from before is continued. We find out that long after meeting Anira, Seth became a mother. She named her baby boy Sed, and the three of them became a family. Years later, Seth set off to a place called the Tower of Mirrors to complete her goal and confront Gongora, leaving Sed in Anira's care. She was to return to her original world along with the other immortals. In the world of mortals, Seth was a prisoner, not in a literal sense aside from being trapped in the cave, but in a metaphorical one. Alone in the world, condemned to watch loved ones wither and die, the life of a pirate represented a freedom that she was spiritually denied. To return to her world would be to escape in some sense. But Gongora had already planned for Seth's arrival. With his power, he turned Anira into his puppet and had him attack Sed, ripping his leg off. Seth lost control, and when she came to, Anira was dead, Seth's sword in his chest. Gongora made sure Seth was racked with guilt, since if she'd never come to the tower, none of this would have happened. He sent her back to her prison. With her faithful companion dead and her emotions uncontrollable, he sealed her memories, and that's the last thing Seth recalls until the game begins. Even though the 1,000 years of memories focus on Kaim, it doesn't feel as though you're always consciously meant to see him as the main character solely. Now Seth takes the limelight in many scenes, and we begin to understand her with a depth comparable to Kaim. The main characters all get their due at some point or another, but it feels like a story led by the Immortals rather than just Kaim or anyone else. Attention between characters is shifted so subtly you almost don't notice that the game has been immersing you in someone else's story for long periods of time. That becomes especially true later on, but for now the party arrives at the Experimental Staff, a facility under the watchful eye of Gongora. Get used to this industrial tech-base look, by the way. You'll be spending a lot of time in industrial tech bases in this game. Gongora is confronted, fully aware of his past evil deeds, and even gloating about them.
Seth, you got it wrong. It was you who killed Anira.
No, it was you, Gongora!
I just know this guy drives a Ford Raptor and leaves his fucking brights on all the time. He tells the Immortals that they were all brought here for a reason. They all tried to commit atrocities except for Gongora, who is the only one sticking to their noble cause. But the time for talk has passed as the battle begins. I gotta point out how awesome Gongora's battle music is. It's hilariously evil and extremely hype-inducing. You know what? let's talk about that soundtrack. Sakaguchi collaborated with his longtime friend and associate, Nobuo Uematsu, who surely needs no introduction. His work is legendary, often combining an eclectic mix of influences to produce some of the most memorable, epic, complex, and heart-wrenching music to ever be in a video game. As big of a claim as it may be, I believe that Lost Odyssey might represent some of Uematsu's absolute finest work. The vast majority of the soundtrack is orchestrated. Uematsu's music sounds iconic, whether he's sequencing tunes on an NES sound chip, using an SC-88 Pro Synth, or leaving it in the hands of an orchestra. That's a testament to his versatility as a composer, and versatile is exactly the word I would use to describe Lost Odyssey's soundtrack. There's often a need in RPGs to have emotional scenes accompanied by stirring pieces of music. That's especially true for the Final Fantasy series, for which Uematsu composed much of the music. Even in comparison to those games, Lost Odyssey's tracks are filled with emotional highs and lows which are beautifully realized by the use of an orchestra. Still, many of the game's more minimalistic tracks carry the same level of emotional weight. There's a small pool of tunes which are often used in the 1,000 Years of Dream sequences, and these are among the game's most evocative pieces. The track Parting Forever does a wonderful job of communicating 1,000 years of love and loss. The standard battle track, The Gun Barrel of Battle, is epic, but also unexpectedly moving. It's densely layered with explosive brass, cello driving the fast pace of battles, and counter melodies reinforcing this emotional complexity beyond just, let's fight the bad guys. This is the regular battle theme. You hear this while fighting these things. The duality between these bombastic pieces and the simpler piano-driven melodies really only scratches the surface of what makes Lost Odyssey so special. It's no secret that Uematsu is a big fan of progressive rock and metal, so it only makes sense that he'd go balls to the walls on the game's boss themes. So many of these tracks are just cool, they're so much fun, and the game always properly exercises restraint in which theme it uses for which boss. More significant story bosses are given suitably more grounded or emotional themes, while the zanier, more off-the-wall tracks are saved for the game's less important bosses. Sometimes the game uses minimalistic or no music at all during the more harrowing scenes, such as the destroyed city of Kent. I think what characterizes Lost Odyssey's soundtrack most of all is the way in which it bridges the gap from RPG elements of old to the new world of high-capacity storage, better sound quality, and no compromises. Many of the tracks feel like callbacks to that simpler time in RPGs that Lost Odyssey evokes. The battle victory music, for instance, is just a celebration of classic JRPG victory themes. Synthesized sounds are heavily reminiscent of the sound font used for titles like FF7 as well. I don't know how Lost Odyssey threads the needle between prog metal, symphony orchestra, and the classic one man in a room with a synth tracks, but I'll be damned if it doesn't work. The soundtrack, like the game itself, is a love letter to the past and an exciting look at the potential of the future. No expense is spared in setting atmosphere, creating adrenaline, shedding tears, and inspiring nostalgia. It's a fantastically arranged soundtrack, packed with variety, but always cohesive, and it is a tremendous boon for Lost Odyssey. Back in the fight with Gongora, no matter how well you do, you'll find that this boss fight is unwinnable. Tolton, who's joined Gongora at the staff, happens to walk into a very suspicious scene. Gongora assuages Tolton's worries by painting the party as assassins and initiates a staff self-destruct in which the party narrowly avoids. The rules of immortality are somewhat ambiguous in Lost Odyssey, as while the immortals can't be killed by normal means, it seems they can be destroyed. I'm assuming that's why Gongora used the self-destruct sequence instead of just killing them, but I don't know, maybe I'm giving him too much credit. At this point, Disc 3 begins. This disc contains the most unique stretch of plot in the game due to how it's structured. First of all, the dark magic keeping hold of Saman is dispelled. I gotta tell you, this is a massive comfiness overcorrection. The nighttime ambience is gone. And what happened to the crow? The party decides to head to the enemy nation of Gotsa. Ming, as Queen of Numara, will arrange a meeting with Gotsa's king, and the party hopes to acquire a ship that can make the trip to Ura. Gotsa is indeed a technologically advanced civilization. Its industry and military surpass Ura's, and the city is experiencing growing pains as a result. There's a massive disparity in the quality of life between the upper echelons of the city and the have-nots sequestered in dingy apartment blocks. It's here where the parties split up in order to follow different leads. Kaim and Sarah unexpectedly bump into an old acquaintance, King Mars of Gotsa. Many years ago, the couple saved the young Mars from dying of exposure. From there, they spent a lot of time with him, teaching him about the importance of truth and how it alone endures no matter the destruction or lies that are wrought on a nation. It's a lesson that the king once took to heart but no longer does, believing political lies and deception to be a necessary evil in running a nation. For immortals, truth is a perfectly convenient reality. For mortals, truth can be an obstacle, a discomfort, and something they may not even be alive to see prevail. This is the justification Mars uses. Truth must be circumvented when reality calls for it. Despite the king's change in disposition, Kaim and Sarah tell him about Gongora's plot, encouraging him to seek peace with all of the other nations. Meanwhile, Mac and Cook hear about an aurora where deceased loved ones can visit the living. They sneak onto a train and take off. Which is stupid, but like, what am I gonna do? Get mad because 2 kids miss their dead mom? Anyway, disaster ensues. When Kaim and Sarah find out, they run off to find their grandchildren. The remaining party members head to a diplomacy meeting between the rulers of the 3 nations. Gongora, taking advantage of Tolton's absence, announces to the world that Tolton has died at Gotsa's hands, and the war against them will rage on. He declares himself new ruler of Ura, using Grand Staff to summon meteorites and freezing spells in Gotsa. Tolton, who's been inadvertently feeding info back to Gongora with a spyglass, uses a teleportation spell to escape to Ura and accidentally brings Seth along. That's a lot of plotting. From here, the story of Lost Odyssey isn't told in sequential order. You flash back and forth between the stories of Jansen and Ming on the freezing train, Kaim and Sarah, as well as Mac and Cook trying to find each other, and Tolton and Seth avoiding Gongora's patrols in Ura. The game has been linear up to this point, but that is especially true now. What could be a veritable gauntlet through endless dungeons actually turns out to be relatively enjoyable for a few different reasons. First of all, it's nice to see the character dynamics at work. Kaim and Sarah, though the circumstances aren't the most romantic, are working together as a team again after many years of being apart. Mac and Cook are in a very dire spot. It's interesting to see Mac, having been the crybaby up till now, finding the strength he's admired in Kaim. Ming and Jansen make a surprisingly compatible duo, although Ming is a somewhat less interesting character right now. Her stiff royal upbringing contrasts well with Jansen's silliness though, and they manage to even each other out. Ming becomes a little more open and honest, while Jansen puts aside the ladies' man facade, clearly developing feelings for Ming. Seth and Tolton, I swear you could have a game centered around these two.
How dare you! I am Tolton, your king! You shall obey me! Silence, fool! What?
Seth is a hyper-competent and irreverent pirate, while Tolton is naive, clumsy, and easily embarrassed due to his sheltered upbringing. Tolton, we're trying to keep a low profile. Do you have to wear the diamond-studded armor? Take me with my diamonds, or you can't have me at all. Kaim and Sarah manage to find Cook and Mac, using what little strength they have left just keeping themselves warm. Just when all seems well, a magical energy seizes them with excruciating pain. Sarah slices the train in half, saving Cook and Mac, but seemingly condemning her and Kaim to death. Meanwhile, a human sacrifice takes place in Ura, which will supposedly seal Gongora's royal coronation. Goats and troops then invade. That's what the giant helmets are for? Ziplining? I've never seen such a chilling sight in all my days. Seth and Tolton go to free the prisoners that were meant to be sacrificed. Like many scenes in Lost Odyssey, the one that follows is both touching and ridiculous.
Seth!
It's okay. It's okay. Oh.
Mama?
Yep, this is my boy.
So they find Seth, Seth's son and a feared pirate in his own right. With he and Tolton here, we've now recruited every member of the party. I have to say, Lost Odyssey nails party composition. Not just in terms of having the right number of melee users or mages, but in terms of personalities, design, and what each brings to the table. Every single one of them feels significant, like they belong to the greater story of the game. You know I'm a big fan of that cranky old man character, but for that character to be the son of the female lead really flips that trope on its head. Seth and Tolton also don't get along very well. Seth, being a free spirit and a criminal, isn't a big fan of old Silver Spoon Tolton. And Tolton, well, he's basically just scared of Seth. Seth, being the mother of the group, makes sure that Seth doesn't hurt Tolton's feelings too much.
Seth, stop picking on him. It's not his fault he was born with a silver spoon in his mouth.
So sorry, Your Graciousness. But that's the way I am. I get heartburn whenever I see someone in power.
It's just a fun dynamic, and I can honestly say I didn't expect Seth to have a part to play in the game, beyond backstory. It's a pleasant surprise. Speaking of unexpected things in Lost Odyssey, I really wasn't prepared for the return to Jansen and Ming's story.
How I feel for you and what I wanna say keeps getting locked inside. I like to make what you are.
A power ballad? Are Jansen and Ming really at the point of deserving a power ballad just yet? I mean, Kaim and Sarah, yeah, sure, possible power ballad material, but Jansen and Ming? There's been like 2.5 instances of light flirting. Interestingly enough, this song was recorded by Sheena Easton for Lost Odyssey specifically. Easton is an incredibly successful singer. She's been on Broadway, won 6 Grammys, and sang a James Bond theme song. Your mom and dad probably have a cassette tape of her somewhere in the basement. And I never in a million years expected to hear her voice in Lost Odyssey. Sakaguchi himself apparently wrote the lyrics. The game's design is uniquely Japanese, but I feel like some of the presentation is influenced by Western sensibilities. Rather than being dubbed later, the game was originally recorded in English, with cutscenes synced to that version, making it the definitive one, I suppose. The focus on improv and more organic back and forths is somewhat uncommon in the genre. There's also a lot of movement and careful framing of shots in the cutscenes as well, including some comic book style panels showing certain characters and their expressions, or manga style if you prefer. At the same time, there's something very gritty and raw about the cutscenes. It's as if many of the shots are made using handheld cameras, giving it the intensity of an action film. The larger movements in most cutscenes are motion captured by their actor, while facial expressions are keyframed by hand. I think it looks great. It really helps to see how characters carry themselves. The handmade facial animations are a special touch that communicates subtle expressions. These betray a character's true feelings, even when those are left unsaid. In any case, I can't help but think that Sakaguchi's 4-year-long Hollywood tribulations informed the presentation of this game. Unreal 3 also inherently grounds the game in something less colorful and extravagant than the typical JRPG. It'd be interesting to know if Microsoft pushed Mistwalker in this direction, or if it was an in-house decision to appeal to Western audiences. I digress. The two wander back to Gotza, which has been ravaged and frozen over entirely by Gongora's spell. Following in the footsteps of Kaim and Sarah, they come across Mac and Cook on the train tracks. There's a boss here, and this is the one where I really screwed myself over back in the day. You have to use Jansen, Ming, Mac, and Cook. But back then, I didn't use Mac and Cook at all, so they were dead weight. The fight was over in a matter of seconds. Even now, having very intentionally leveled my characters, this is not an easy fight. In fact, it's one of the few where I died. This fight, more than any, I think, showcases just how important it is to keep that GC bar up. If it drains, it's very likely that the boss can just wipe your entire party out in one turn. 4 mages do not make for a particularly effective bulwark, so I slapped a ring on Mac that turns him into a killing machine. These eyes hide a deep pain. I know there's a question on everybody's mind. Where's General Kakanis? Oh, no? That's not what you're asking? Oh, does the game have a sewer dungeon? That's what you're asking. Yes, this game has a sewer dungeon, and seldom do they come in a more laborious package. The sewer dungeon goes on, and on. Random battle, and on. There are switches to activate, platforms to traverse, doors to open, walkways to move. Sooner or later, you'll miss a switch or hit the wrong one, and then, random battle, and then you'll have to go back through the sewer dungeon to find it. Many people love Disc 3 of this game. They consider it to be the best one, I assume, because of the constant barrage of plot-related events. There are a lot of dungeons, yes, but they always feel relevant to what you're doing, so it's just forward momentum for 10 or so hours. Nonetheless, I find this stretch of game to be suffocatingly linear. You see, Lost Odyssey saves its myriad side content and exploration for Disc 4. Disc 1 and 2 are setting up events with plenty of room to breathe and have some downtime. Disc 3 feels repetitive due to its structure. Cutscene, dungeon, boss, cutscene, dungeon, boss. The game's pacing is just all over the place, and I feel like a few less plot-related ventures would have given the game some much-needed space at this point. Of course, I'm in the minority. People really like this disc. I like parts of it. The introduction of certain characters and plot elements really sends the game into overdrive. You know shit's hitting the fan soon. One such plot event is Grand Staff bringing to life a herd of dormant magical creatures which wreak havoc on Urins and Goatsins alike at Gongora's behest. These monsters are armored with plates reminiscent of ancient magic ruins, kind of a cool spin on the biomechanical look. They remind me of the weapons from FF7, both in terms of design and the circumstances in which they arrive. Seth, Sed, and Tolton are confronted by one in the underground, but manage to fend it off thanks to Sed's crack shooting. I love guns in turn-based games, have I mentioned that? It's nice to have a gun guy. Down here we find Sed's impounded pirate ship, the Nautilus, which is highly advanced and whose underwater capabilities kicks off some QuickTime events. Well, it was 2007, so I guess it had to happen sooner or later. Throughout all of these events, the banter between Tolton and Sed is absolutely charming. I can't help but feel bad for Tolton. There's something about his sheltered puppy dog personality that makes me want to see him succeed. And that's something he wants for himself as well, having lived in the shadow of his father. With the monarchy being torn down and replaced with a republic, his identity is completely shattered. He holds no ill will towards the people for wanting a change, but with no father figure to guide him, he, like the immortals, needs to find out who he is. Although he never would have associated with a criminal like Sed before, Tolton finds many admirable traits in him and aspires to become more like the pirate. Sed puts aside his sardonic attitude, surprised to see legitimate potential in Tolton. I just love to see it.
Was lovely.
Meanwhile, Jansen, Ming, and company find the site of Kaim and Sarah's train crash, which leads them into a deep cave. Near the end, they find the couple near death, but manage to bring them back. The Nautilus then appears in the nearby underground lake. I find myself asking, how did they know where to find everybody? Well, apparently Ming's pendant actually works as a magical homing beacon. But then I'm wondering, wait a minute, doesn't Tolton have a spyglass showing Gongora where he is? And the game answers that too. Nope, we got rid of it. I'm not kidding when I say every time I feel like I'm jumping on a plot inconsistency, the game provides me with answers minutes or sometimes seconds later. It's kind of refreshing to have all the bases covered. I guess that's the benefit of a more digestible plot like this. The team decides to hunt Gongora down, likely on the now mobile Grand Staff as opposed to in Ura. Things open up massively from here on out, to the point where it almost feels like an entirely different game. First of all, you have the Nautilus. Like the boat from earlier, you can sail around unlocking new ports and locations along with them. The Nautilus also acts as a submersible, allowing you to find new underwater locations, return to old ones, and find a litany of collectibles that incentivize exploration. I was under the impression that Lost Odyssey was basically side quest free, and that disappointed me. But I couldn't have been more wrong. This just so happens to be one of the most backloaded RPGs I've ever played, along with Shadowheart's Covenant maybe. That breathing room I was hoping for earlier is here in spades. Now, you're not going to get a ton of exciting, novel content. Many of these side quests involve returning to earlier areas or collecting something. For instance, heading to different dungeons and placing nodes down for scientists' field research, or delivering letters and messages from refugee camps to their loved ones in the city. This comprises most of the side content, and you're very likely to miss it. If you want to see everything the game has to offer, you have to comb through every area, speaking with every NPC. It's always the least conspicuous ones that have something for you to do. The layouts of the major cities have changed, which is pretty cool. Gotza is completely frozen over, and Ura is now especially war-torn. Certain party members afford you different opportunities as well. Seth is a handyman, so wherever there's a broken machine that needs fixing, he steps up to the plate. Tolton is capable of interacting with royal crests, mysterious monoliths you've been seeing up till this point. Not unlike the Zeal crest and its chests in Chrono Trigger, Tolton can unlock these crests for specialized equipment. If you head back to Gongora's now abandoned manor, there's a small side venture which gives you some insight into the nature of the Immortals. Apparently, the Immortals' world was extremely unstable and primed for destruction. Their world was infected by something like a virus from the denizens of the world they're in now. Their consciousness went through a portal where they inhabited new bodies. Because of how distorted the flow of time is between the two worlds, 1,000 years for humans is only 1 year for our Immortals, which means they're not entirely immortal. Kaim, Seth, Ming, Sarah, and Gongora were actually investigators sent here on a mission. It seems only Gongora really remembered that. Much like how Sarah kept the memory of Kaim alive through record keeping, so too has Gongora been keeping recordings to periodically remind himself of his mission should his memory be lost. The most important thing revealed with this recording is the nature of this virus. Emotions, human emotions, despite their short lives, are powerful enough to distort the fabric of the other world's reality. It seems emotions do not exist wherever the Immortals come from. Those emotions have proved irresistible for the Five. It's an interesting idea and definitely gives Lost Odyssey's story a bit more gravitas, but frankly, this whole alternate dimension thing, despite how important it feels, isn't really given much attention throughout the plot. We get no direct experience with it, which is fine, but it's talked about so little too. I mean, an alternate dimension that our characters' spirits came from seems significant, but it's surprisingly never really extrapolated upon, even when it has more of a presence towards the end of the game. I guess that's what this side activity is meant to do, but it doesn't really do an effective job of answering questions like most of the game does. I'd like to better understand this alternate dimension, or at least hear an explanation for how immortality really works, but it's left vague. It doesn't create a sense of mystique, but rather feels ambiguous so as to be a get-out-of-jail-free card when immortality comes up. Should Kaim be dead right now? I don't know, it's fucking alternate dimensions, I don't gotta explain nothing. Many of the dreams are left optional at this point as well, with most of the remaining ones being related to war. Triggering in refugee camps, makeshift hospitals, and destroyed cities, these missable dreams are among the best the game has to offer. The ranking of lives takes place during a pandemic in a kingdom obsessed with hierarchy. The story touches on the absurdity of a world in which some lives are seen as less intrinsically valuable than others. It takes a strength of will to recognize this for what it is, a strength most don't have, even when we think we do. Bright Rain explores how the innocence of childhood is so unfairly robbed by war and conflict, how the reality of prejudices destroy hopes and dreams, and how that same prejudice breeds a cycle of hatred. On the topic of the cycle of hatred, Beyond the Wall is one of my favorites. The wall between two previously warring nations is coming down in what should be a time of jubilation, but some see the new alliance as a tragedy. Fed propaganda from birth, the hate for the other is so strong in the heart of one man that without that hate, he's lost. It's a beautiful story of redemption and how the dismantling of walls we build literally and within ourselves is sometimes more difficult than it looks in hindsight. Lost Odyssey is an anti-war game, which of course, is a pretty easy and vacuous thing to say on its own. But it goes beyond war bad. The benefit of the granularity in the 1,000 Years of Dreams is personifying the evil and often the side effects of conflict that aren't easily explored. War is usually talked about in the abstract, in terms of historical significance or death numbers, which is hard to internalize. In video games, war is often portrayed as romantic, especially RPGs where death itself is superficial. Kaim's 1,000-year tour of battlefields has given him an insight that's crucial to the game's storytelling. When you face one war in your life, it's significant. When you face hundreds of wars, it becomes routine, predictable, and pointless. From the elderly woman who refuses to abandon her farm in the middle of a battlefield, to the troubled conscience of a general who orders the slaughter of innocents, Lost Odyssey shines a light on the stories underneath the bravado of conflict. The stories told in Lost Odyssey showcase a heightened awareness of mortality, how cruel and senseless it is that such already short and fleeting lives are cut down in war. War over disagreements that one day won't even be significant enough to warrant a full page in a history book. Kaim's long life, with its extensive hindsight, is the perfect platform with which to explore these topics. It's especially impressive that Lost Odyssey makes such an impression with content that's entirely optional and missable. The side content doesn't end there though, not by a long shot. First of all, you've got the optional super boss, Persona. This is arguably the most complex boss in the game for a number of reasons. Its face changes, swapping between physical and magical resistance. The kicker is the special attack it uses, called Darkness, which causes massive damage to health and MP, as well as causing random status effects. This is a fight you'll probably need to lose at least once or twice to get a full understanding of how it works. From there, you'll have to take advantage of Immortals with their skill slots, meticulously planning out your resistances. Certain options like nullifying petrification and healing when using the guard option are necessary. If you don't cleverly game the system, you'll almost definitely have your ass kicked. One mechanic that really comes in handy here is that Immortals are resurrected after 3 turns of being dead, as long as somebody in the party is still alive. You've got to keep this in mind and choose who to focus your preservation efforts on, striving for longevity rather than pure offensive power. It's a really interesting boss fight, and I kinda wish there was more of these tough late game bosses. Your options in battle open up exponentially at the end game for a few different reasons. Your party will now be at the point where they're reaching endgame levels, and with that comes a number of interesting skills. Tolton's Royal Equipment skill, once linked and learned, allows Immortals to equip previously Tolton exclusive gear.
At last, the sword which once belonged to my father is finally mine. I can take my place as rightful—
Yoink. A lot of mortals have specialties like this in order to justify their place in the party. Tolton's weapons deal great damage, and his royal accessories, such as the Quad Element Amulet, which completely nullifies elemental damage, is excellent. That skill can be learned and equipped by Immortals. Jansen's special ability is equipping 3 accessories, which too can be learned by Immortals, vastly increasing the potential for learning multiple skills at once. Seth earns double the SP per battle. That can be learned, cutting the time it takes to learn all of these skills in half. These are just examples. There's a lot of potential for breaking the game as Immortals. The level of sheer destructive power you can dish out if you're smart about skill linking at this point is ridiculous, and planning these things out is really fun. There's hidden caves, a complex bonus dungeon, a battle arena. There's even a long-ass DLC dungeon if for some reason that sounds appealing to you. You find a village of these little guys called Kelolons. The appeal of that should be a bit more obvious. Secret village populated by the game's mascot character is one of my favorite JRPG tropes, personally. More bosses, underwater caves, snowfield mazes, Seth's hidden pirate fortress. I think you probably get the point. If you like lots of content and long games and don't really care about pacing, Lost Odyssey's got you covered. But only if you make it to Disc 4. Hell, the Nautilus can even fly now, which makes exploring the world and connecting to ports even easier. Once you've had your fill of side content, it'll be time to return to the main quest. At this point, the story focuses more on Ming, whose characterization has been somewhat neglected till now. Long ago, Gongora set his monsters loose on Numara, promising to call them off only if she allowed him to seal her memory, which she did. Now, with her memory returning, the monsters that were sealed long ago are resurrected and begin marching towards Numara. This kicks off a mini-game wherein you have to hunt down the 4 monsters in your boat before they make it to Numara. The clock is always ticking. Even while fighting one of them, the other 3 will continue marching. You have to make quick work of them, even resorting to putting them to sleep in order to buy more time. It's tense, fun, and makes mechanical use of the Nautilus beyond moving from location to location. In that way, it's reminiscent of chasing the ultimate weapon in FF7, just makes the whole situation feel bigger, more intense. Now I know there's a question on everybody's mind: where's General Kakanis? Well, he's pretty disappointed to see everybody returning to Numara, which forces him to accelerate his coup. This results in a fight that's surprisingly hard. What can I say? Hail to the king, baby! After defeating him, Ming temporarily passes control of the kingdom to her handmaidens, knowing that her destiny leads her to Gongora. The final 1,000 Years of Dreams story triggers at this point, and it's an interesting one. It's not about Kaim or Seth, but Ming, and gives some insight in regard to her 1,000-year rule of Numara. Namely, it shows her to be quite cynical, and an amazing judge of character. With so many of her trusted advisors and generals dying of old age and passing on the torch, she's had to become shrewd. If nothing else, it illustrates the fact that Kakanis is one of dozens, if not hundreds of people who thought they could get the better of Ming, and he is among the less clever. With Numara in capable hands, we find the White Boa. It's a massive steamship that can destroy ice and allows us to access more areas in the world map. It's extremely difficult to control, accelerates very slowly, and looks like a shoe. You can dock the Nautilus in the White Boa and take it to places it wouldn't otherwise be able to reach. It's pretty cool, another example of the game opening itself up to exploration with so very little time left. Romance between Jansen and Ming is now in full bloom as she takes the reins and gives us our first on-screen intermortal kiss.
Aunt Ming, this is the guy for you?
He's the only one for me.
There's a pang of something unavoidably tragic throughout it all, though. Jansen's gonna die of old age. Ming won't. This knowledge somewhat undermines what should be a nice moment, but for the here and now, both of them are happy, and there's no more beating around the bush. They're a couple now. With the White Boa, the team can penetrate the ice surrounding the Grand Staff and confront Gongora. Remember when I said get used to the industrial tech base? Well, this is an industrial tech base. The enemies in this base are a gigantic pain in the ass and are never easily defeated. You've got to solve various puzzles and carefully balance on these pipes. Son of a bitch. After a boss fight with Gongora's right-hand man, he begins harnessing a massive quantity of magic energy, enough to destroy the Tower of Mirrors, sealing shut the portal to the Immortals world forever. Let's briefly talk about Gongora. There's no one way to write a villain well, and villains that are mustache-twirlingly evil can be fun and appropriate. But given Lost Odyssey's focus on providing so much depth for its characters, Gongora's one-dimensionality sticks out like a sore thumb. Each of the main cast has a great deal of personality communicated through their design. Kaim is neither a stereotypical, hyper-masculine protagonist, nor is he androgynous. He actually looks incredibly ordinary for an immortal protagonist, yet he's tall, graceful, and carries himself with a quiet self-assuredness that comes from 1,000 years of experience. The jury's still out on the strategic potential of exposing the small of your back, though. Seth wears a simple dress with armor covering her legs and arms. With her hair up, ready for battle, she's a pirate warrior, function over form, with enough lightness to move around easily, paralleling her quick wit and carefree nature. The point I'm trying to make is this: almost everybody's design communicates something about their personality or status. So what is Gongora trying to tell us? That he's an asshat? I will say that the angular costume he has later on is more interesting, but as a character he just falls flat. I once read somebody compare him to Jesse the Body Ventura, which has been seared into my mind.
I was a royal advisor, now I'm finally ready to talk. I'm gonna use Grand Staff to end the CIA once and for all. It's time to go off the grid.
Gongora looks like, sounds like, and acts like an accomplice to a much greater evil, but he's not. Considering the Immortals all came to this world together, it would have been interesting to see how Gongora has evolved over time, what he's learned, why he's been consumed with power in this world, thereby abandoning his mission. But we don't really get that. Even in the optional quest where you can listen to his journal entry, there's nothing substantive there. He never really comes across as that intimidating. He's a great plotter and schemer, no doubt about that, but I just have trouble buying the idea that he's the world's ultimate evil. His plans for world domination are also kind of wishy-washy. I suppose that you could argue Gongora is the game's way of showing that anyone can succumb to the desire for power, losing their principles in the process. But I would argue that King Mars of Gotza was a more effective and nuanced example of this, even given a fraction of the screen time. I guess I would say that the individual moments and characters themselves are the real stars of Lost Odyssey. The game's most complex, gripping, and thought-provoking moments are really irrelevant to the larger plot. I think that's what has most people sticking around, seeing the game through. So there's a part 2 to this industrial tech base, which is a bit more annoying than the previous. Maybe take that with a grain of salt. If I'm being honest with you, I can't tell if I'm just more impatient knowing that the end is so close, or if the dungeon really does just suck more than normal. I see this as a trend in RPGs, and it's got me wondering if perhaps I'm the problem. There's a lot of operating computers to move platforms, using machines in the right sequence, timing button presses. It culminates in a boss battle wherein you split your party into 2 teams and have to kill 2 enemies simultaneously. If one party kills the extra-dimensional enemy before the other, it's a game over. I know that the game established Seth as a tinkerer, but I'd love to know how he understands so much about alternate dimensions. Is it just intuitive knowledge? The only string theory Seth understood up till now was fixing that harp back in Numara. Oh, that's not funny. The team reaches Gongora, but damaging him seems to be quite impossible. He uses Jansen as a puppet and takes the opportunity to demolish the party with meteorite magic. Jansen comes to, and the party once again escapes before the self-destruction sequence finishes. I would recommend Gongora stop trying to do that. At last, the party uses the Nautilus to enter the Tower of Mirrors from underwater. It's a really cool reveal. I like the otherworldly design and only wish that some of the game's dungeons were so ethereal and creative. But this is no dungeon, it's a confrontation, plain and simple. The light from the mirrors which connect to the Immortal's world causes time to start moving again, resulting in pain and aging to anyone who sets foot in them. The final boss fight takes place across 3 distinct phases. The first is a fairly straightforward battle with a magic beast, not unlike the many we've fought already. The difference here is that the boss absorbs all magic, leaving your physical fighters as the only damage dealers and magicians providing support. Phase 2 is actually a more scripted segment of the boss battle. You're forced to battle with the 4 immortals only, all other party members are off limits. So, if like me you've been relying on Jansen's black magic and keen sense of style to get you through fights, you might be in trouble here. I can only praise Mistwalker for not having another dungeon to go through. If you need to grind, it's a pretty simple matter of reloading a save. Here, Gongora's elemental weaknesses constantly shift. You need to chip away at his health while he deals massive damage, causing those not in your party to step in and help. The standout feature of this fight is the music, which is just something else. There's like a Japanese chant throughout the music that makes the song sound like some kind of symphonic Japanese nu metal. Completely unique, and don't you dare pretend you're too cool to have this hype you up. I see your wallet chain there, you can't hide from me. The mortals use what power they have left to block the mirrors, which are providing Gongora power. Thus launches into the final phase of the battle. Like before, his elements periodically switch, which is easily dealt with as long as you have the analysis ability. It's a very traditional boss fight, and in light of the optional super bosses, it's pretty easy. Gongora is slain, but technical difficulties abound. The mortals are trapped on the mirror's side of a barrier, causing rapid aging and horrible pain.
Mama, it looks like I'm gone before you.
Stop talking like that! We do something, Kaim! What will we tell her? She wanted us to take care of her. They're our responsibility.
The dub is great in general, but the performances here are on another level. Normally, you could rest assured that everything will be fine, but because this is Lost Odyssey, there's a very real possibility that these characters will die.
We'll be okay.
Mom's waiting for us.
Gongora rises, telling the immortals that they can free their friends, but only by destroying the mirror. This would prevent them from ever returning and seal this world's fate as being ruled by Gongora. That would be, if not for Seth's unexpected sacrifice. There's something about an old man crying for his mama that will always make me sad. Thanks to Seth's sacrifice dragging herself and Gongora back into their gray, emotionless world, the party and the world is saved. In a way, it feels like Seth paying her penance for the killing of Anaira, something that's saddled her with guilt for years. It's a particularly cruel fate, knowing that not even the release of death awaits her, but an easy decision when faced with outliving her baby boy. The controls of the Nautilus are magically jammed, but a mysterious force arrives to loosen them, allowing the party to escape.
Mama. Just when I had finally found you.
Just when I had finally found you is the line that ties everything together for me. Not long after the story began, Kaim was reunited with a daughter who died only minutes later. The virus of emotion that's long infected the mortals has found its way into the hearts of the immortals too. Nobody is safe from caring, for better or for worse. Kaim and the others were meant to return to their world after carrying out their mission. Simple, only they found so much that matters to them that by the time they could return, doing so was akin to a death sentence. Instead, Kaim and Sarah stay behind. They start a farm near Lyram's home, choosing to raise their grandchildren together and giving them the childhood that Lyram never had. Thankfully, they stay in touch with Uncle Seth, who now has a family, even if not by blood.
What a great-looking family!
Hi, Seth. Thanks for picking us up. Good to see you again. Hi, Seth.
I'm telling you, you guys sure are demanding. What am I? Your chauffeur?
If you can't help but smile all the way through this ending, you, like me, may be a sentimental boomer. Friends and family make their way to the royal wedding of King Jansen and Queen Ming, with King Tolton officiating. His people may eventually be pissed when they realize they were finessed back into a monarchy, but for now, they celebrate. Kaim and Sarah have made their peace with immortality, resolving to, and I quote, "Take it easy." Yet, like Jansen and Ming's relationship, there's something bittersweet about the entire ending. They get to live as a family, but one day they'll have to watch their grandchildren grow old and pass away, and their great-grandchildren. In a way, it's tragic, but that's what Lost Odyssey is all about. Beyond the beauty in life, the simple things, and the milestones, tragedy and pain are inevitable. To love is to lose, and to lose is agonizing. But grief, like life, is a journey from which new strength can be found and lessons can be learned. If there's one thing Lost Odyssey's 1,000 Years of Dreams teach, it's that sorrow wouldn't be so profound if goodness itself wasn't such a miracle. War, deception, and cruelty may tear apart homes, countries, and kingdoms, but in 1,000 years, the embers that are goodness and empathy still live. They'll live for 1,000 years after that, too, immortal. As long as they burn, there's still hope for meaningful lives and a better world. The pain of existence can be endured while that hope remains. I've got to admit, Lost Odyssey is a tough game to evaluate. Broken into its constituent pieces, it seems straightforward enough. Turn-based battle system, hilariously evil villain, a few novel features here and there, but nothing crazy. The game very much basks in the afterglow of a bygone era in the genre, at least at the time. While most developers were moving into action-based combat systems and finding ways to trim downtime, Lost Odyssey sticks closely to tradition. In its structure, storytelling, and battle system, it's all very familiar ground. Where this game shines is beneath that surface. The depths of its themes, its examination of morality and the things we hold dear, is world-class. The immortality angle is really just a way of opening up conversations about the beauty and the banal, things in life that only hold meaning to us specifically because we don't have all the time in the world to enjoy them, the things we often take for granted. Lost Odyssey beautifully holds up a magnifying glass to these things. It's funny, anger-inducing, and most often of all, sad. This game tugged on my heartstrings more than almost any other game I can think of. It's a game that has greatly benefited from a replay after the many years I've lived since my first attempt. The short stories may not be exciting, the immortals may not be wildly eccentric characters with shonen anime powers, for the most part, but reading between the lines, you'll find something intensely identifiable, a depth of appreciation that only comes from life experience. In that way, Lost Odyssey is the antithesis to its predecessor, Blue Dragon. It's a game that takes its time, that shines when you offer it patience and move to its rhythm. It's a game that reminds us that life is about the journey, not the destination. For all of those reasons and more, the game deserves to be remembered beyond that JRPG on the Xbox. And at the same time, there is a lot to look past in order to get the most out of the game. Its pacing ranges from languid to breakneck, without enough breathing room to get the most out of its excellent cast. The heavily aliased visuals, along with enough browns, greens, and grays to last a lifetime, aren't likely to inspire joy like many of the traditional RPGs released since. Puzzles that fall flat, dysfunctional stealth sequences, and a world map that begs to be explored for 90% of the runtime all drag this 50-plus hour game down. Yet thanks to its writing, it endures. The 1,000 Years of Dreams elegantly handle delicate subjects, and each of the stories is a worthwhile read in their own right. Likeable characters and a gorgeous soundtrack elevate the game's fairly average plot to heights it never would have reached otherwise. Lost Odyssey is a game worth visiting, and as an adult with a deeper understanding of the world around you, revisiting too. Life is short. It's nice to reflect on what makes it sweet. Mistwalker is still kicking. After a few more noteworthy outings, including 2011's The Last Story, they began to scale back their operation. Rather than working with larger studios, they operate alone, having largely spent the years since Lost Odyssey working on mobile games. Sakaguchi has repeatedly spoken about his retirement over the years and declared that he would be stepping away from full-time development with the release of 2021's Fantasian. Creativity and ambition are perennial traits, so let's take that with a grain of salt. Still, were it true, Lost Odyssey would stand as the jewel in Mistwalker's crown. A poignant reminder of the JRPG's humble roots and an enduring meditation on the terrible beauty of life itself. Thank you for watching this Lost Odyssey retrospective. I hope you enjoyed the video. It wouldn't have been possible without the support of my patrons. I will now answer some patron questions. Okay, it's not pretentious, but I would say Andrei Tarkovsky's Stalker probably fits the bill. It would be pretentious if you were at like a family gathering and your uncle asked, "Anybody seen any good flicks lately?" I do not, but I know a lot of people who do. For me, I get so easily absorbed in something that I'm listening to, I end up losing my concentration and my editing gets worse. Sometimes I'll throw on rain sounds in the background. I guess that kind of counts. Perhaps someday, if the stars align, I would consider doing an SMT game. The problem is that most of the accessible ones have like 12-hour analysis videos made on them already. You know, I don't know if I have any one favorite, but sometimes a rack of good barbecue ribs just hits in some magical way like nothing else in this world. I don't know if it's a landmark, but in Star Fox 64, when you hit all these boosts in Meteo, you go to this like psychedelic acid trip space world with very weird music. That left a huge impression on me. There's something eerie about the fact that none of the crew want to talk about it. There's no dialogue from that point to the rest of the level, like, we just seen something we shouldn't have. I think wisdom would probably be the most practical for me. Courage is cool, but I don't think I would be the best guy to have infinite power. I would also like to thank those in my Persons of Lordly Caliber Patreon tier. Adam Safranco, Matthew Sean Dick, Banana Turnip, Avil and Hime Takamura, Drew Manilis, Spencer Kennelly, Smo Bun, John Turcott, Captain, BB Squirrel, Shane Shack, Mr. Shifty, Buster Drew, Francois, Fanar, Fenrir Lives, Silvar, Olo Shadow, Guko, Jordan Laughlin, Jordan Miller, Hayden Hudson, Rocket Man, Jay Hyun, Azure Midsummer, Destrega, Tepateg Tournament, F, James Adair, Sable Dragon Rook, Cameron himself, Einel Hander, Kelly Slaughter, Zeta, Caleb the Wanderer, Nicholas Esposito, Stephen Clancy, Cat Poop Nachos, Chew, Isaac Hampton, Ben Augusto, Beta Zeta, NVTF, Worston Show, Okurio, Kenny Mitchell, Maginect, Grand Roman Pontifex, Maximum Chalabartis, Fourth the Humble, Mech Exile, Base Forever, Battalion, Plip Vivanici, The Bloke, Hypnotoad Trance. Alright, that was 4 takes. And I tried to incorporate some Wim Hof breathing in between there, but yeah, I don't know. I just got to start hyper-oxygenating my blood to make it through that. Thank you all very much for your outstanding support. If you would like to support my channel while gaining access to bonus videos, podcasts, and more, please consider checking out my Patreon. A link will be in the description. Until I see you all next time, stay healthy, wealthy, and wise.